You open the closet door on a gray spring morning, and before your eyes even adjust to the dark, your nose tells you everything. That heavy, sour, wet paper smell. You reach for your good wool coat, and the shoulder feels damp, like it has been breathing in the night air and never letting it go. You walk down into the basement, and the concrete floor is sweating, little beads of water sitting on the surface, like the wall itself is crying. Upstairs, the bathroom mirror never quite clears, even an hour after the shower. This is not a flood. This is not a pipe you can point to and call a plumber about. This is humidity, just sitting in your house, soaking into the wood, feeding the mold, curling the pages of the boxes you forgot you stored. Most people, the moment they catch that smell, drive straight to the hardware store and walk out $200 lighter with a humming plastic box that drips into a bucket and runs up the power bill every month of the wet season. But in an old farmhouse, in a cellar where the dirt still showed at the edge of the floor, that same problem was handled with a mason jar, a fistful of rock salt, and a scrap of cheesecloth. No motor, no cord, no bill. Just a jar sitting quiet in the corner, pulling the wet right out of the air, one grain of salt at a time. By the end of this video, I am going to show you exactly how to build that jar, why it works, and the one mistake that makes most people give up on it and call the old method a myth, when really, they just built it wrong. Let me tell you plainly how we got here, because it did not happen by accident. Somewhere along the way, ordinary households stopped trusting anything that did not plug in. A box with a fan and a compressor feels modern, feels serious, feels like it must be doing more than a jar of salt sitting on a shelf. So we buy it. A small dehumidifier runs you somewhere between $100 and $250, depending on the size of the room. Then it draws power every single hour it runs, and in a damp climate, that unit is running most of the day during spring and fall. Add that to your electric bill, season after season, and you are easily clearing $50 to $100 a year just feeding the machine. Then the compressor wears out, or the bucket sensor fails, or the thing starts rattling, and in 3 or 4 years you are back at the store buying another one. There is no profit in anyone reminding you that a jar of salt does the same basic job for a fraction of the cost. So nobody does. The modern aisle has no reason to whisper that into your ear. What used to be common knowledge in every farmhouse pantry became almost invisible, tucked behind rows of plastic units with digital readouts and blinking lights. I first saw the jar method the way most of these old tricks find me, which is by accident, standing in somebody else's cellar. There was an old farm wife in the eastern part of Pennsylvania Dutch country, a woman I will call Ruth, though that was not quite her name, who kept a root cellar under her kitchen the way her mother had, and her grandmother before that. The air down there should have been thick and choking, the kind of damp that makes your chest feel tight after a few minutes. Instead, it smelled clean, almost sweet, like cedar and dry stone. In the corner sat 3-quart jars on a low shelf, each one wrapped in a bit of muslin cloth instead of a metal lid, held in place with a rubber band. Inside, a gray-white mound of coarse salt, packed down and slightly damp looking at the bottom, like wet sand at low tide. I asked her what it was, expecting some complicated answer. She just said it was the cellar jar, the way her mother always kept one, and that it kept the potatoes from sweating and the canning labels from peeling off the glass. She told me the trick was never to seal it shut, because a sealed jar cannot breathe, and a jar that cannot breathe cannot pull anything out of the air around it. She said the old people understood something that most folks today never think about. A problem that comes from the air has to be solved by the air, not locked away behind a closed lid. That line stuck with me longer than I expected it to. The mistake is not the tool. The mistake is the way people use it. What surprised me most was not the jar itself, but how unbothered she was by it. No checking a digital display, no remembering to empty a tray, no worrying about a breaker tripping during canning season. Every few weeks she would tip the jar out onto an old cookie sheet, set it near the stove or out in the sun for an afternoon, and pour it right back in once it dried out and turned loose and crumbly again. That was the whole maintenance routine. A body learns, if he pays attention. And what I learned standing in that cellar was that the old method was not a workaround for not having electricity. It was simply a better tool for a problem that electricity was never really built to solve. Quietly and cheaply, in a small enclosed space. Now, here is the part most folks miss when somebody tells them salt pulls water out of the air. They picture a kitchen shaker of table salt sitting in a damp room doing absolutely nothing, and they are not wrong to picture that, because table salt barely does the job at all. The salt that matters here is coarse, plain salt, the kind sold for water softeners, ice cream making, or canning, without the additives that table salt carries to keep it from clumping in a shaker. Plain salt is what chemists call hygroscopic, which is really just a fancy word for a substance that pulls moisture out of the air around it and holds onto that moisture instead of letting it sit as vapor. Air that carries a lot of water vapor is humid air. Air that has had some of that vapor pulled out and trapped somewhere else is drier air. The salt crystal has a natural pull on water molecules floating nearby, drawing them in and sticking them to its surface, then slowly dissolving its outer layer into a thin brine as it keeps absorbing more. This is not magic. It is just knowing how the thing works. The reason cellars, closets, and bathrooms respond so well to this is that they are small, mostly enclosed spaces where the air does not move around much. A jar of salt cannot do a thing for a whole house with the windows open and air constantly trading places with the outside. But in a closet, a cellar corner, a gun safe, a camper, or a small bathroom, the air sits still long enough for the salt to keep working on it, hour after hour, slowly lowering how much water vapor is floating around in that space. The old people did not need to know the chemistry term for it. They just knew that a jar of salt left near canned goods kept the cellar from smelling sour, and a jar left in the wardrobe kept the wool coats from feeling damp come spring. The reason makes sense once you understand it, and once you understand it, the method stops feeling like folklore and starts feeling like simple physics sitting quietly on a shelf. But that is not the part that surprised me most. The real surprise came later, when Ruth told me the jar worked even better with one more ingredient added to it, something most modern dehumidifier companies would never want you thinking about, because it costs next to nothing. A few chunks of plain charcoal, broken from a natural lump charcoal briquette, tucked down into the bottom of the jar underneath the salt. Charcoal is full of tiny pores, and those pores do two things at once. They soak up extra moisture the salt has not gotten to yet, and they trap the musty odor that comes along with damp air, the smell that makes a closet or a cellar feel unpleasant even after the dampness itself improves. Salt handles the water, charcoal handles the smell. Together, in one jar, for the price of a bag of pickling salt and a few pieces of charcoal, you have something that does the job of two separate aisle products for under $4 total. Let me walk you through building it step by step, because the order matters more than people expect. Start with a wide-mouth quart mason jar, the kind used for canning, because the open top matters here. Take 2 or 3 chunks of plain natural lump charcoal, broken into pieces roughly the size of a walnut, and set them in the bottom of the jar. Do not use instant light charcoal briquettes, since those are treated with lighter fluid chemicals you do not want sitting near your clothes or your pantry shelves. On top of the charcoal, pour in coarse pickling salt or plain water softener salt until the jar is roughly 3/4 full. Do not pack it down tight. The salt needs loose space around the crystals so air can move through the whole jar, not just sit on the surface. For the lid, this is the part that decides whether the whole thing works or fails completely. Take a square of cheesecloth or thin cotton muslin, lay it over the open mouth of the jar, and secure it with the metal canning ring with the flat lid left off, or simply a wide rubber band if you do not have a canning ring handy. The cloth keeps dust, bugs, and curious pets out, while still letting the air inside the jar trade places freely with the air in the room. This is the part that decides whether it works or fails, because a sealed lid, even one with small holes, traps the air right where it is and stops the salt from ever meeting fresh, humid air to pull moisture from. Set the jar somewhere low in the room if you can, since damp air tends to settle near the floor. A closet floor, a basement corner, the bottom shelf of a pantry, the floor of a camper or boat cabin or tucked beside a gun safe all work well. One jar handles a small closet or cabinet space comfortably. For a basement room or a larger walk-in closet, 2 or 3 jars spread around the space will do far more than one jar crammed in a single corner, since the salt can only pull moisture from the air close around it. Check the jar every week or 2 at first, just to get a feel for how fast your particular space draws it down. You will know it is working when the salt at the bottom starts to look wet, slightly clumped, almost like damp sand, while the top stays loose and dry. Once most of the jar looks wet and heavy, rather than loose and powdery, it has done about as much as it can for the moment and needs to be recharged. Recharging is simple. Pour the salt out onto a baking sheet, spread it thin, and either set it in a low oven around 200 degrees for 30 to 40 minutes, or set it out in direct sunlight on a dry, warm day for a few hours, stirring it once or twice. The water that the salt absorbed evaporates back out. The crystals dry and turn loose again, and you pour the same salt right back into the jar over the charcoal and start over. The charcoal generally lasts several recharge cycles before it needs replacing, since it is mostly catching odor rather than bulk moisture. The real mistake comes here, and it is the one that convinces most people the whole method is nonsense. They build the jar. They seal it up tight with the metal lid screwed down flat, thinking that keeps the salt fresh and protected, and 3 weeks later they wonder why the closet still smells damp. A sealed jar is just salt in storage. It cannot trade air with the room, so it cannot pull anything out of that room. This is why so many people online insist the jar trick does not work, when the truth is they used a sealed lid instead of cloth, and the air inside their closet never had a chance to reach the salt at all. A second common mistake is reaching for ordinary table salt, because it is what happens to be sitting in the kitchen cabinet. Table salt carries anti-caking additives specifically designed to resist absorbing moisture, which is exactly the opposite of what you want in this jar. Plain canning salt, pickling salt, or coarse water softener salt, with no additives listed on the bag, is what actually pulls its weight here. A third mistake is expecting one jar to dry out a flooded basement or a room with standing water from a leaking pipe. This method is built for ambient household humidity, the everyday dampness that makes air feel heavy and closets feel musty. If you are dealing with an actual leak, a flooded crawl space, or visible standing water, that calls for fixing the source of the water, and likely a real mechanical dehumidifier or a professional, not a jar on a shelf. For small to moderate humidity problems in an enclosed space, though, the jar earns its place. A fourth thing worth saying plainly, since this involves something a child or pet could get into. Keep the jar up on a shelf, rather than on the floor in a home with toddlers or curious dogs, since the salt brine at the bottom is not meant to be eaten or pawed through, and a knocked-over jar makes a mess nobody wants to clean up. It is a household tool, not a toy, and treating it with that bit of common sense keeps it safe for everyone in the house. Once you have the jar built and placed correctly, you will start finding more spots for it than you expected. In the bathroom, a jar tucked behind the toilet or under the sink handles the lingering steam smell long after the shower curtain has dried. In the laundry room, a jar near the dryer vent catches the extra humidity that builds up from wet clothes waiting their turn. In a camper or travel trailer, where space is tight and a plug-in dehumidifier is not always practical, 2 or 3 small jars tucked into cabinets keep the whole rig smelling fresh through a humid camping season. Gun safes and tool chests benefit the same way, since rust loves nothing more than trapped moisture sitting against bare metal. Even a car trunk or a boat cabin, both classic spots for that musty, closed-up smell, respond well to a single jar left in the corner for a few weeks at a time. You do not need a farmhouse or an acre of land to use any of this. An apartment closet, a suburban basement, a mobile home bathroom, a rented storage unit. All of them are small, enclosed, poorly ventilated spaces, exactly like the cellar Ruth kept her jars in. The method does not care what kind of house it sits in. It only cares whether the air around it is humid, and whether it has room to breathe. If you want to see the difference for yourself before you trust me on it, try this small test. Take 2 identical jars, fill them the same way with the same amount of salt and charcoal, but seal one with the cheesecloth method and seal the other with the regular metal canning lid screwed down tight. Set both in the same damp closet for 2 weeks, and then weigh them, or simply tip them out and look. The cloth-covered jar will feel heavier, the salt clumped and visibly wet at the bottom. The sealed jar will feel almost exactly like it did the day you filled it, salt still loose and dry, because it never had the chance to do anything at all. That single side-by-side test tells you everything about why the lid matters more than the salt itself. This is where I want to step back from the method for a moment, because the real value here is not just the few dollars you save against a plastic box from the store. It is what that jar represents. Before every household problem had a corresponding bottle, box, subscription, or monthly bill waiting on a shelf at the store, families solved these everyday problems with what was already sitting in the pantry. A handful of salt, a scrap of cloth, a jar somebody was already washing out to reuse anyway. Not because it was clever or trendy, but because it worked, and because it cost almost nothing, and because a household that could solve its own small problems did not have to wait on anyone else to fix them. There is something worth sitting with in that. Not every old method survived into the world we live in now, but the ones that did survive earned their place the hard way, through generations of people who did not have the luxury of buying their way out of a damp closet. When you build that jar and set it on your own shelf, you are not just managing humidity for $4 instead of $200. You are picking back up a small piece of knowledge that almost slipped away entirely. The kind of knowledge that used to pass from a grandmother to a daughter at a kitchen table, rather than from a glossy box on a store shelf. So here is what I want from you before you go. Tell me in the comments where you are watching this from, what state or county, because I am always curious how far these old farmhouse methods have traveled. Tell me if your grandmother or grandfather kept something like this jar, without you ever knowing exactly why it worked. And tell me what year your house was built, because the older the house, the more of these old tricks it was probably built to need in the first place. If you want more of these old household methods, the kind that quietly worked for generations before they were replaced by something plugged into the wall, stay with me. There is a great deal more the old people knew that we have only just started remembering. In the next video, I'm going to show you the old cellar trick for keeping food cool through the middle of summer without ever running a refrigerator, using nothing more than a stone floor, a damp cloth, and the kind of airflow most modern kitchens were never built to use. I will see you there.